Shavua Tov, a ethical dilemma arises when your competitor in business asks you for marketing advice when you happen to be an expert in marketing and they are not. Let's say you have two pizza stores in the same neighborhood. They're competing with each other, and one of them has excellent marketing and brings in customers left and right, and the other one has been failing at it, and they come to you as the successful entrepreneur to ask you your advice. What do you tell them? You realize that if you give them good marketing advice, well, they're going to start taking customers away from you. So what are you supposed to do? Well, this is an ethical dilemma that is related directly to one of the famous commandments in the Torah reading of this week. Thou shalt not place a stumbling block in front of the blind. Now, on the surface, this particular commandment seems very straightforward. A blind person can't see where they're going. You're going to play a practical joke on them, or worse. You put something in front of them, they trip, they fall, they get injured. Simple as that. But the rabbis take it quite out of its literal meaning and expand it to become a global concept. For example, the famous commentary Rashi says that this is a prohibition against giving anyone who is considered blind in any matter. It doesn't mean literally physically blind, but it could be lacking knowledge or awareness. That also creates a certain blindness when it comes to making a decision. So you're going to give a blind person, someone who doesn't know how to make the right decision, bad advice, and thus trip them up in whatever it is they're asking for advice, whether it be economic or personal or health-wise or whatever. And so in our particular case, one would be forbidden to give bad marketing advice, even though the competition would then use good advice against you, basically, take away customers from you. That's tough. You're not allowed to give them bad advice. And as a matter of fact, if a person has proper abundance mentality, they should be happy to give advice to even their competition, because after all, at the end of the day, we all need to eat. I suppose we all need to eat pizza, and why not be trusting that there is enough to go around? So that would be one explanation. We see that the rabbis take this prohibition about tripping up a blind person completely out of its literal meaning. Another interpretation, and a famous one at that, is relating to causing someone else to sin, enabling them to commit a transgression. This already is in the Talmud. The rabbis give the example of the Nazarite. A Nazarite is someone who has taken an oath to not drink wine. So the Nazarite is going to be on one side of a river, and you will be on the other side of the river. Here, as we're setting up the scene. And that Nazarite has no access to the bottle of wine, which is in your hand because you're on the other side of the river. And the Nazarite sees that wine, and well, they would like to have it, but they're not allowed to because that's a violation of their oath. And since it's not on their side of the river, they can't gain it. But if you decide to be friendly and toss it over to them, well, then you have now enabled them to commit a sin. You have committed the transgression of putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. The Nazarite is the blind person who had this drive to drink wine, which he was not allowed to drink. And you enabled it. You put the rock there to cause him to trip. As it were, you put the wine into his cup, enabling him to drink. The rabbis comment that if the Nazarite was on the same side of the river as you, and he could have gotten the wine without you giving it to him, but you, out of the kindness of your heart, just picked it up and handed it over. So then you wouldn't violate the verse in a full sense, but on a rabbinical level, meaning it's still forbidden, but it's not strictly what the verse is talking about. But in these both interpretations, we see that the rabbis take this verse out of its literal meaning and expand it to mean either giving bad advice or enabling someone else to sin. The Ramban, a great medieval commentator, Rabbi Moses ben Nachman, he gives a real shocking interpretation of this verse. You'll be amazed. He says, you know what this verse means? That if you see a blind person walking down the street, don't put something in front of him to cause him to trip and fall. In other words, he takes the verse literally. So we have three ways of looking at this verse, either a bad advice or enabling sin, or the literal interpretation causing someone to fall. So how is it that the rabbis took a verse? Why is the Ramban's explanation not the one that everyone agrees on? Why did the other rabbis take it so far? It could be because in the book of Deuteronomy, there are the blessings and the curses, which are to be uttered by the tribes when they enter the land of Israel on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And one of the curses that the people utter is, "Cursed is the man," or woman for that matter, who leads a blind person astray on the way. Mashge iver baderech means causes a blind person on the way to err, to go the wrong way. So therefore, that verse seems to be referring back to this about not putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. And there the meaning is clearly more general than just that specific thing of tripping them up. It's causing them to go astray, and they're leading anyone astray in any way, shape, or form. Whether they are physically blind or just knowledge-wise blind is considered prohibited. I think there's another way to explain why the rabbis take this particular prohibition about tripping a blind person out of its literal and extend it to becoming a general concept. And that is the verse itself. The verse itself that has this phrase actually begins with another prohibition. And that prohibition is, listen to this one because it's a powerful one. Do not curse the deaf person. So the verse reads in total, do not curse the deaf person. Do not put a splunding, splunding. I don't know what a splunding is. Do not put a stumbling block in front of the blind person. You shall fear the Lord, I am your God. You shall fear the Lord, I am your God is the reason why you need to do these things, because the blind person and the deaf person, well, they won't know who did it. So therefore God says, you have to fear me. I know everything. But the first commandment in that verse is quite remarkable. Do not curse the deaf person. Why not? Why can't the person is deaf? They're standing in front of me. I can call them names. They don't know. They won't know. It won't hurt them. They'll have no problems at all, despite whatever I say. Why is that prohibited? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. But if that is prohibited, if causing harm to someone that the person who is the victim feels no harm, feels no pain, the deaf person has no idea that as far as they know, you said compliments. So therefore, if that's forbidden, then certainly it is unnecessary to write that you may not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, because, well, the blind person who trips and falls, they are going to get hurt. That's called what's a kal vachomer, a fortiori logic. If this is the case, then certainly that is the case. So if you're not allowed to curse a deaf person, which causes no discomfort to the deaf person at all, then certainly you're not allowed to trip a blind person, which causes them a lot of discomfort. So therefore the whole section about tripping up the blind person is unnecessary. Therefore the rabbis say it must come to be more inclusive. And so that's the way they go. Now, an interesting idea that's in the Torah is, before I say that, I just want to comment that if the Torah prohibits cursing a deaf person, that is a very direct response to, unfortunately, the moral development of large swaths of humanity. You see, we all develop morally in different phases. And one of the earlier, more primitive phases we pass through is behaving morally because of self-preservation. In other words, I don't speed, not because it's dangerous, but because I don't want to get a ticket. Bottom line. But if I know that I'll be able to drive, there's no police, the police are on strike, who knows what, and I can drive 3 times the limit and, just fly all across the highway, so that I'll do it because it's safety be darned, I'll do it anyway, right? A lot of people have that mentality that if you can get away with it, if the police aren't there, then you can get away with it, so go right ahead. And so the Torah is saying an emphatic no. Do not curse a deaf person. You can get away with it. Not only can you get away with it, but no harm done. But that is not the way a person should be. We'll talk about that shortly. Now, there's also a body of laws in the Torah that relate to damages. If somebody breaks somebody's property, if their animal causes damage, if Reuven's ox gores Shimon's ox, and so forth and so on, there are rules how much have to be paid. But where do we find in the Torah that it is forbidden to cause damage to someone else's property? We only find the laws relating to if it happened, what's the penalty? And yes, that does imply that there's a prohibition, but the Torah writes out the prohibitions. And where is the prohibition for causing damage to somebody else's property? There is no verse in the Torah that says, thou shalt not damage somebody else's property. There are many possibilities. The rabbis are occupied with this, especially the medieval scholars. Some say it's an extension of the prohibition of theft, that by causing damage to someone else, you're causing them monetary loss. You could say that. Some say that it is an extension of the positive commandment of thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself, which is also in our week's Torah reading. So therefore, If you love your neighbor as yourself, well, obviously you don't want someone to come and smash your TV set, so you shouldn't smash theirs either. And there is one rabbi, Rabbi Meir Abu Lafia, who lived in the 12th century in Spain. His book is called Yad Ramah, and he says, it's coming from this verse, thou shalt not put a stumbling block in front of a blind person. Because here's an example of someone like the Ramban's radical explanation, if you will, that he's literally causing a blind person to trip and be injured. He's causing damage, and so therefore the Torah is forbidding it, and this therefore extends to everything else. One could use logic. In other words, if causing a blind person to trip and fall, where I'm doing it in a passive way. I didn't push the blind person. I didn't hit them. I simply placed something on the road and they're going to go flying right over it, okay? So that's called girama, or causing it to happen, an indirect damage. So if indirect damage is prohibited, then kal vachomer, certainly all the more so direct damage, where I go and smash someone's TV and cause them, direct bodily injury. So certainly that will be prohibited. So from all of these things, we see a very important perspective, especially from the prohibition about cursing the deaf person and tripping up the blind person and giving good advice and all of these things. And that is that they are the prohibition against tripping a blind person is a negation of the entire concept of communal mutual responsibility. In Hebrew we call that arevut. All Israel are responsible for each other. We should be concerned about the welfare of each other, and that is an extension of the commandment of thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And therefore you do not want people doing things to you, whether you feel it or you don't. You want people to respect you, then you must respect others. And therefore we have to feel a sense of responsibility to our fellow Jews by not giving them bad advice, certainly by not tempting them or enabling them to sin, which causes them damage. And even if they're not aware of it, even if the person is deaf, not to curse them, because every single soul is holy and is coming from the throne of God up in Shemayim. These souls are hewn from beneath the divine throne of glory. So every human being has the image of God within them. Therefore, they must be dear to us. We must respect them, and we must show concern for them, even if they're not aware of it. And it's not just Jews, even idolaters. The Talmud has a discussion that this prohibition about causing someone to sin even applies to idolaters. In certain times in our history, it was forbidden to do certain business with an idolater, because the concern at a period of time which was around their holiday, because we were concerned that the idolater might be so grateful for the good business he just had that he will then go into his temple and worship idols. And worshiping idols is forbidden for anybody, Jew or non-Jew. And therefore it turns out that the Jew, by giving them a good business deal, has in a sense encouraged them, facilitated them in worshiping idols. So we see that this responsibility for the welfare of every human being, spiritually, physically, and economically, applies even to those who are idol worshippers, who are as far away as possible from the morality of the Torah. And let that be a lesson to all of us, that we should always be focused with responsibility to help protect our fellow Jews and fellow human beings, both their spirituality, both their business and economic success, and their physical success.